Bright and James had been best friends for as long as they could remember. Their friendship wasn't just any ordinary bond. It was like that of brothers. Ever since they were 5 years old, their families had lived side by side, and from that moment they became inseparable. Everything they did together. If one had a toy, the other had the same one. If one got into trouble, the other was right there with him. Their friendship was so strong that even their parents saw them as a package deal. James' mother often said, "Having you two around feels like raising twins." Even though they didn't look alike, people often assumed they were brothers. Growing up in wealthy families meant they had everything a child could wish for: expensive toys, the best clothes, and vacations in exotic places. But for them, none of that mattered as much as their time together. They would spend hours playing, building imaginary kingdoms, and making promises to remain best friends forever. Their friendship continued as they grew older. They attended the same schools, sat next to each other in class, and even shared the same hobbies. Teachers often joked that Bright and James had one brain split into two bodies because they always thought alike. Even when other kids formed their own small groups, Bright and James remained loyal to each other. They weren't just friends, they were brothers by heart. When they entered high school, their bond only grew stronger. While other students formed new friendships and relationships, Bright and James remained each other's closest companions. Whether it was playing soccer, studying for exams, or simply talking about life, they shared everything. Whenever one of them faced a problem, the other was there to solve it. If James got into trouble, Bright would always defend him, and if Bright was ever in need, James would be the first to help. At night, it was common for one of them to sleep over at the other's house. James' mother, Mrs. Adams, grew used to seeing Bright around so much that she often referred to him as her second son. Bright's parents, too, treated James as one of their own. It was a perfect friendship, one that seemed unbreakable. When the time came for university, fate seemed to favor them once again. They both got accepted into the same university, something they had hoped for since childhood. It was another adventure for them, another chapter to write together. University life was a mix of freedom, fun, and challenges. Late-night study sessions, weekend parties, and endless talks about the future became a routine for them. Some students even mistook them for twins because they were always seen together. They made many friends in university, but none as close as what they had with each other. No matter how many people surrounded them, Bright and James always returned to each other at the end of the day. They had each other's backs no matter what. If one was in trouble, the other was always there to help. If one needed advice, the other was the first to give it. It seemed like nothing could ever break their bond. One afternoon during their final year, James received a phone call from home. He was laughing at one of Bright's jokes when his phone rang. As soon as he picked up, his mother's trembling voice reached his ears. "James, you need to come home right away," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Your father is very sick." James' heart skipped a beat. His father had always been strong and healthy. What could have happened so suddenly? Without hesitation, Bright placed a hand on James' shoulder. "I'm coming with you." There was no need to argue. They packed their bags and rushed to catch the first available bus home. The journey felt endless. James sat in silence, staring out the window, his mind clouded with fear. Bright, sitting beside him, didn't speak either. He knew his best friend was going through something unimaginable, and there were no words to ease his worry. But deep inside, James felt comforted knowing Bright was by his side. By the time they arrived home, the worst had already happened. James' father had passed away. The house was filled with sorrow. Relatives and family friends gathered, mourning the loss of a great man. James' mother was in tears, her face pale with grief. When she saw James, she broke down completely. She held on to him tightly, sobbing into his chest. "He's gone, James, he's gone." James felt numb. He couldn't process it. The man who had raised him, taught him how to ride a bike, helped him with his studies, and given him life advice, was gone forever. Bright stood quietly beside James, feeling helpless. He wanted to say something comforting, but nothing felt right. Instead, he stayed close, making sure James wasn't alone. The funeral was heartbreaking. James felt a heavy emptiness inside him, something he had never felt before. No amount of comforting words could take away the pain of losing a father. After the funeral, life had to go on. James and Bright returned to university to finish their final semester. But something had changed. James wasn't the same anymore. The once cheerful, energetic young man had become distant and quiet. He still smiled, still laughed at Bright's jokes, but there was a sadness in his eyes that never left. Bright tried his best to help him. He forced James to go out, watch movies and play games, anything to make him forget the pain even for a moment. And slowly James started to heal. Months passed and they finally graduated. With degrees in their hands and new opportunities ahead, they returned home, ready to start the next chapter of their lives. But neither of them knew that their friendship was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. James and Bright had finally graduated. Their years of studying, late-night cramming and working hard had paid off. They were now young men stepping into a new phase of life, yet nothing about them seemed to change. Their friendship remained just as strong, and as they returned home, it was as if they had never left. Bright still spent most of his time at James' house, coming and going freely. It wasn't unusual for him to walk into the kitchen, grab food from the fridge, or sit in the living room watching TV with James' mother, Mrs. Adams. After all, he had been like family for years. However, something subtle but strange began to happen. At first, it was barely noticeable, just small changes in behavior, the kind that wouldn't raise suspicion. But as time passed, James couldn't shake off the feeling that things were different. It started with the way his mother and Bright spoke to each other. Before, their conversations were casual and simple, about school, meals, or James himself. But now, James noticed that they talked a little longer than usual. Sometimes when he walked into the room, the air felt different, like they had been discussing something they didn't want him to hear. Then there were the glances. James noticed his mother and Bright exchanging looks that didn't seem normal. There was an unspoken connection between them that made James uncomfortable, but he brushed it off. Maybe I'm just imagining things, he told himself. But as time passed, the changes became more obvious. Bright, who had always been open about everything, started acting distant and distracted. He was still James' best friend, still laughing and spending time with him, but James noticed moments where Bright seemed preoccupied. Some nights, Bright would come over like usual but leave earlier than expected. Other times he would cancel their usual meetups for no real reason. One evening, James found Bright in the living room, texting someone with a small smile on his face. "Who's that?" James asked, teasingly nudging his friend. Bright quickly locked his phone. "No one. Just a friend." James raised an eyebrow. "A friend? You've never hidden anything from me before." Bright forced a laugh. "It's nothing serious, man. Just someone I'm talking to." James didn't think much of it at the time, but his gut told him something was off. One afternoon, James came home unexpectedly after running a quick errand. As he walked through the front door, he heard laughter from the kitchen. It was his mother's voice. But it wasn't just a casual laugh. It was the kind of laugh that was soft and playful, the kind James had only ever heard when his father was still alive. Then he heard Bright's voice. Curious, James stepped closer. Through the slightly open kitchen door, he saw his mother and Bright standing close together. They weren't touching, but the way they looked at each other made James stop in his tracks. His mother's eyes sparkled in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. And Bright, he had that same small smile James had noticed earlier when he was texting. James' chest tightened. This is weird. Really weird. He decided not to confront them, not yet. Instead, he pretended he hadn't seen anything and quietly left the house, his mind racing. Over the next few weeks, Bright's behavior became even more suspicious. He started avoiding certain questions. He was at James' house even when James wasn't home. He would suddenly leave when James arrived, making awkward excuses. His mother started dressing differently, wearing elegant dresses and perfume even when she wasn't going out. James tried to convince himself that he was overthinking everything, but deep down he knew something was wrong. One evening he decided to test his suspicion. "Bright, you've been acting weird lately," James said casually as they sat in his room. "You're always busy now. Got a secret girlfriend or something?" Bright hesitated for just a second, but it was enough. James noticed the way his friend shifted uncomfortably, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nah man, I've just had a lot on my mind," Bright replied. "You know, figuring out life after university and all that." James didn't believe him. The final straw came when James came home late one night. He had been out with some friends, and as he entered the house he saw something that made his heart stop. Bright's motorcycle was parked outside. It was already past 10 p.m. Why was Bright here so late, when James wasn't home? James felt his stomach twist as he stepped inside. The house was silent, but there was an uneasy feeling in the air. He moved toward the living room, and that's when he heard it, the sound of whispered voices. James' heartbeat pounded in his ears. He took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway. Just as he was about to step forward, the voices stopped. Then his mother's voice. "I should go check if James is back," she said. James quickly moved away, pretending to have just entered the house normally. A few seconds later, his mother appeared in the hallway, looking startled to see him. "Oh, James," she said, forcing a smile. "You're home early." James glanced toward the living room, but Bright wasn't there. Had he hidden? Something was definitely going on. His mother quickly walked past him, heading toward her room. James didn't stop her. He didn't say a word. But in his mind, a storm was raging. Why was Bright here so late? Why were they whispering? What were they hiding from me? James felt something inside him shift. A deep, unsettling feeling that his best friend and his mother were keeping a very big secret. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he was going to find out. James couldn't sleep that night. His mind was a battlefield of thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. His mother and Bright were hiding something from him, he was sure of it. The way they looked at each other, the secret conversations, Bright's sudden distance. It all pointed to one thing. But James refused to believe it. "Oh, it can't be what I think it is." The thought of his best friend and his mother having any kind of secret relationship made his stomach turn. Bright was like a brother to him, and his mother was the one person he respected most in the world. If what he suspected was true, it would be a betrayal beyond words. So he needed proof. He couldn't accuse them without being absolutely certain. The next morning, James pretended everything was normal. He greeted his mother like usual, ate breakfast, and even texted Bright to meet up later. But all the while he was paying close attention. His mother seemed nervous. She avoided looking at him for too long and spoke in a softer tone than usual. Bright, on the other hand, acted like nothing had changed, cracking jokes and talking about random things. But James wasn't fooled. After breakfast, his mother left to visit a friend and Bright went home. This was James' chance. He went to his mother's room, somewhere he hadn't stepped foot in for years. He hesitated at the door before slowly pushing it open. Everything seemed normal at first. The neatly made bed, the soft scent of her perfume, the family pictures on the dresser. But James wasn't looking for ordinary things. He searched the drawers, the closet, everywhere he could think of, until he saw something unexpected. A men's jacket draped over the chair. His heart pounded as he picked it up. It wasn't his father's. It wasn't his. It was Bright's. James swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. He checked the pockets and found a receipt from a restaurant dated just 3 days ago. 2 meals. 1 bottle of wine. A cozy dinner for 2. They went out together. Without telling me. That's when he noticed something else. A small, delicate gold bracelet on the nightstand. It wasn't his mother's usual style. It looked like a gift. One she had recently received. James clenched his fists. It was all becoming clear. James didn't wait. He had seen enough. That evening when Bright came over, James was ready. They sat in the living room, the air tense with unspoken words. "Bright," James said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to ask you something." Bright leaned back on the couch. "Yeah, man, what's up?" James stared at him, searching his face for any sign of guilt. "Are you hiding something from me?" Bright's expression remained neutral, but James didn't miss the way his fingers tensed slightly. "What? Oh. Why would I?" James inhaled deeply. "I know you've been seeing my mother." The room fell into a deafening silence. Bright didn't respond immediately. His face changed, just for a second, a flicker of panic before he quickly masked it. James felt something inside him snap. "Don't lie to me, Bright," James said, his voice rising. "I saw your jacket in her room. I saw the dinner receipt. I've noticed the way you two look at each other. So just tell me the truth." Bright sighed and rubbed his face, suddenly looking tired. He hesitated as if choosing his words carefully. "James," he finally said, "I didn't want you to find out like this." James' chest tightened. So it was true. He felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. His best friend, his brother, had been sneaking around with his mother behind his back. "How long?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bright hesitated again. "A few months." James let out a bitter laugh. "Months. All this time they had been lying to him. Hiding this from him. Making him feel like a fool in his own home. How could you do this?" James snapped, his anger finally spilling over. Of all the people in the world, Bright. My mother. Bright sat up, his own frustration showing. James, I didn't plan for this to happen, okay? It just happened. That's not an answer. James shot back. You knew what this would do to me. You knew this was wrong. And my mother, she's old enough to be your. Don't talk about her like that, Bright interrupted, his voice firm. She's not just your mother, James. She's a woman. And we care about each other. James' blood boiled. Care? You're lying to yourself, James said through gritted teeth. This isn't about caring. This is about betrayal. You betrayed me, Bright. Both of you did. Bright looked away, unable to meet James' eyes. I didn't want to hurt you, he murmured. James scoffed. Well, you did. The breaking point. The argument escalated. James couldn't hold back his anger, and Bright for the first time wasn't backing down. He defended his actions, tried to make James understand, but nothing he said made it any better. James felt something inside him break. This wasn't just a fight. This wasn't just an argument between best friends. This was the end of their brotherhood. Finally, James stood up, breathing heavily. Get out. Bright's eyes widened. James. I said get out. James shouted, his voice filled with pain and fury. You're not my friend anymore. You're not welcome in this house. Just leave. Bright stood there for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something. But he didn't. He nodded once, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, and walked out the door. James watched him go, his fists clenched. His chest felt heavy, his heart shattered. And for the first time in his life he realized, Bright was gone. Not just from his house. From his life. From their friendship. From everything they had built since childhood. And James wasn't sure if things could ever be the same again. James sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling, his mind a storm of emotions. His chest felt hollow, yet his heart pounded with anger, betrayal, and sadness. Bright was gone. The man he had called his brother, his closest friend, was no longer a part of his life. Not after what he had done. And his mother. James felt his jaw tighten. His own mother had been sneaking around with his best friend, keeping it a secret, lying to his face. How was he supposed to look at her the same way again? His home, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. Avoidance and distance. For days James avoided his mother. He left early in the morning, aimlessly wandering the city just to be out of the house. When he returned, he went straight to his room, skipping dinner, barely saying a word. Mrs. Adams noticed, of course. She tried to talk to him, but James brushed her off with short, cold answers. He wasn't ready. He didn't even know if he could ever be ready. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. And Bright, he had vanished. No texts. No calls. No attempts to fix things. James told himself he didn't care, but deep down a painful emptiness grew. Their friendship had been his anchor, his constant. And now it was just gone. One evening, after yet another silent dinner, his mother finally had enough. James, we need to talk, she said firmly. James didn't even look up from his plate. There's nothing to talk about. Mrs. Adams sighed, placing her fork down. I know you're angry, but we can't ignore this forever. James let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so now you care about what I think? His mother flinched at his tone, but she didn't back down. I have always cared, James. James slammed his fork onto the table, his patience snapping. No, you didn't. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to me. You wouldn't have destroyed everything. Mrs. Adams took a deep breath. I didn't plan for this to happen. It wasn't meant to hurt you. James scoffed. Oh, so it just magically happened? You and Bright just fell into each other's arms by accident. She looked at him with pleading eyes. James, I was lonely. After your father passed, I felt empty. Bright made me feel alive again. He reminded me that I'm still a person, not just someone's mother. James felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to understand, but he couldn't. He was my best friend, James said, his voice shaking. You knew that. You knew how much he meant to me. And you still went behind my back. His mother's face was filled with guilt. I know, James. And I regret hurting you. I do. But I can't regret something that made me happy, even if it was wrong. James clenched his fists under the table. He couldn't do this. He pushed back his chair and stood up. I can't stay here anymore. Mrs. Adams' eyes widened. James. But he didn't wait to hear more. He turned and walked out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. Days turned into weeks. James stayed with a cousin for a while, avoiding his mother completely. He focused on finding a job, on keeping his mind busy, anything to not think about Bright. But the pain never fully faded. Sometimes he caught himself reaching for his phone, wanting to text Bright about something stupid, something random, just like they used to. But he always stopped himself. Because Bright wasn't his friend anymore. One afternoon, James passed by their old favorite cafe. The memories hit him like a wave. Sitting there for hours, making fun of each other, dreaming about the future. Back when life was simple. Back when they were inseparable. Now James couldn't even step inside. He turned away and kept walking. One evening, as James walked home, he heard a familiar voice behind him. James. He froze. Slowly he turned around, and there he was, Bright. He looked different. His usual easygoing smile was gone, replaced by something more serious. He looked almost tired. James' chest tightened. He hadn't seen him since the fight. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Bright sighed. Can we talk? James crossed his arms. What's there to talk about? Bright hesitated. I never wanted things to end like this. James laughed bitterly. Then maybe you shouldn't have stabbed me in the back. Bright winced. I know I hurt you. And I won't make excuses. I miss you, man. James' heart ached. For a split second he wanted to forgive him. He wanted things to go back to how they were. But he couldn't. You made your choice, Bright, James said, his voice steady. And I made mine. Bright looked down, nodding slowly. He knew there was nothing more to say. Take care, James, he said softly. James watched as his oldest friend walked away, this time for good. And even though he had wanted this, even though he thought he was prepared, it still hurt like hell. The world kept turning, but for James the days seemed to crawl by. He had spent so much of his life looking forward, dreaming about the future with Bright by his side, but now everything had changed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt whole. The silence between him and his mother felt like a wall that kept growing taller, and the weight of everything he had lost pressed down on him, each breath harder to take. He spent weeks avoiding his mother after the confrontation. Their house, once filled with the warmth of shared laughter and love, felt cold and distant now. He stayed out of the house most of the time, walking around the city without any particular destination, letting his feet carry him wherever they would. He found solace in the movement, in the rhythm of his steps, because when he stopped moving his mind would catch up with him and the pain would return. It wasn't that he wanted to run away. It was simply easier to be anywhere but home. But one evening as he sat on a park bench staring at the horizon, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. She hadn't contacted him in days, and the message was simple, but its weight was undeniable. James, please come home. We need to talk. His heart sank. He knew that talk was inevitable. He had been avoiding it, hoping that time would soften the sharp edges of his anger, but it was only getting harder. He had thought he could pretend the problem didn't exist, but it was right in front of him, hanging between him and the only family he had left. With a sigh, James stood up and headed back home. When James walked through the door, he found his mother in the living room, sitting with her hands folded in her lap. She had been waiting for him. There was no warmth in the air, no familiar comfort, just a tension that made the house feel unfamiliar, almost like a stranger's home. Hey, James said quietly, standing just inside the door. He didn't know what else to say. Hey, his mother replied softly, her voice gentle but strained. Thank you for coming home. James nodded and moved toward the couch, sitting down on the edge, keeping a safe distance from her. The space between them felt so much bigger than it had ever been before. I've been thinking, his mother began, her eyes fixed on her hands. About everything. And about you. James wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what she had to say. He had spent so long living in his anger, letting it fester, that the thought of letting it go felt almost impossible. But his mother had always been there for him, even when his world felt upside down, and now it seemed like she was reaching out to him, trying to repair something that had been broken. I know I hurt you, James, she said, her voice breaking slightly. And I regret everything. But I want you to understand it wasn't just about Bright. It was about me feeling so alone after your father died. I was lost and I didn't know how to find my way again. James glanced up at her, but he couldn't find the words. He had heard it all before, how she had been lonely, how she needed something to fill the empty space in her heart. He had been sympathetic to her grief, but this was different. This wasn't about loneliness. This was about betrayal. His mother took a deep breath as though trying to steady herself. I never wanted to hurt you, James. I didn't think about the consequences. I just wanted to feel loved again. To feel like I wasn't invisible. And Bright, he made me feel seen. James closed his eyes, trying to fight back the wave of emotions that were threatening to overtake him. The pain of seeing Bright, his best friend, in a way that felt like a betrayal of their bond, was still fresh. But listening to his mother, he realized something. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he hadn't truly seen hers. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly, looking up at her. Why didn't you come to me first? She looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. I didn't want to lose you, James. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was something I should have kept to myself. But I didn't know how to stop it, and I didn't want to hurt you any more than I already had. She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. The silence stretched between them. James could feel the weight of the years they had spent building a life together, the closeness they had shared, and how fragile it all was. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that everything was okay, that they could move past this and rebuild their relationship. But there was a part of him that was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again. I don't know how to forgive you, Mom, he whispered, his voice barely audible. His mother nodded, her face filled with sorrow. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, James. I don't expect you to forget. I want you to know that I'm sorry. That I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. James swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. It was hard to hold on to his anger when he saw the pain in his mother's eyes. He had always known her as the strong, loving woman who had raised him, but now she seemed so vulnerable. He had never seen her like this before. I don't know if I can ever go back to how things were, he said, shaking his head. But I don't want to keep running from you. I don't want to be angry forever. His mother nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. I don't want that either. I just need you to know that I'm sorry, James. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again. The words were simple, but in that moment they felt like the start of something new. Something fragile but real. James didn't know how long it would take to rebuild what had been broken. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive his mother, or if their relationship would ever go back to the way it was before Bright entered their lives. But one thing was certain: he was willing to try. In the weeks that followed, James and his mother began to rebuild their bond. It wasn't easy. There were awkward silences, unspoken words, and moments when the old pain resurfaced. But they took small steps forward, learning how to communicate again, how to share the space between them without the weight of guilt or shame hanging over them. James still missed Bright. He still ached for the friendship they had shared, the laughter, the memories. But he realized that some things were lost forever, and clinging to the past only made it harder to move forward. He learned to accept that things had changed. He couldn't go back to the way things were, but he could find a new path. One that didn't involve Bright. One that didn't rely on the past. One evening, as James sat with his mother in the living room, they talked about the future. They talked about what they wanted for their lives now, separate from the ghosts of the past. We have each other, his mother said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. And that's enough. James nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself, but it was his life, and it was worth living. As the weeks turned into months, James and his mother found a new rhythm together. There were still moments of silence, moments when they both felt the weight of the past, but they were learning to live with it, not around it. And while James would never forget what had happened, he had come to understand something important: he was not defined by the past. The future was his to shape, and no matter how hard it had been, no matter how much he had lost, he still had the strength to move forward. It wasn't easy. But he was starting to believe that, in time, it would be enough.